Dave Goodman, and I have Brant Bertrand here with me. We are part of the software advisory organization of ISG. And as Jillian noted, we're here to talk about how to reduce your cost and support audits with an effective software asset management program. A number of the areas we're going to cover today is how provider audits highlight gaps in software asset management in organizations. We'll cover some best practices and modeling, show how software asset management should be assembled, as well as process and skills to minimize or negate audit issues that you may experience in the future, and wrap that up with some areas to consider as you move forward with your software asset management program. I'd like to cover some pitfalls when software asset management is not implemented properly in an environment and it's not a key focus. As you can see, this is 3 client scenarios that we've highlighted here. And in all 3 scenarios, software asset management was either fragmented or it was left to the outsourcer to manage. And in the first example, I would note that SAM was spread across the third-party outsourcer and the client environment, but not real good structure. In some cases, they leveraged software asset management tools, Flexera or others, but it wasn't set up properly or used correctly, and IT responded to requests directly, providing a significant amount more data than what was actually required to support the audit request. As you can see, in all 3 scenarios, tens of millions ended up being the result of the audit finding for each one of these. So let me talk a little bit about vendor tactics when audits are being executed in environments. A lot of times, audits are triggered by outsourcing or acquisitions or divestment and even cloud transitions. Vendors like to actually leverage that to true up, for lack of a better word, on what's going on in their environments and, of course, drive revenue. Legally sized threats are used as scare tactics, and time is often used as leverage. As you can see at the top part, we talk about vendors requesting as much data as they can get their hands on when they're performing an audit. There's a myriad of reasons that they do this. One of the reasons is to get additional information so they can look at potentially how they can get new sales. And of course, as I noted already, audit findings are usually high dollar amounts that are put forward to get attention, leveraging list price, and use as a shock demand, which will drive negotiation for commercial perspective to focus on new sales. The last thing I would like to note here on this is that vendors talk to each other. So where one is successful generating revenue, others will likely follow. So let's talk a little bit about correlation of software asset management and audit results. As I talk about this, you can look at it and ascertain maybe where you might be at in your software asset management program. In the top part of this slide, effective SAM amounts to a couple of things. Ensuring that you have up-to-date entitlement, good data management, including not only your entitlement, but your deployed assets, as well as some level of license expertise across your environment, so that way you can actually ensure that you're leveraging licenses properly. At the end of the day, through an audit process, this will actually help you avoid risk and findings, and of course, at the same time, potentially reduce your cost. As you execute proper software asset management or effective software asset management, it puts you in a position where you can actually lead the audit process. And as noted on the right, your audit result will be positive. You will not be writing a big check. Opposing at the bottom of this slide, I'm noting that if you don't have good entitlement management, it's fragmented, or your license knowledge is minimal, that will usually lead to a large dollar demand, and more often than not, the vendor will actually lead the audit process. As I've noted previously, this can lead to tens of millions of dollars in audit findings and, of course, a negative result.
When we talk about software asset management best practices, there's really three areas we look at. Standardization being one of those. And that's really referring to standardizing your processes, having them very well documented for how you deal with software purchasing and deployment, and ensuring that you have a centralized repository for all of your contracts and your maintenance agreements. When we look at the measurement, that's really looking at your use or your utilization. We call it metering, seeing how utilized each individual license is, and keeping tabs on that to really determine how much of your entitlements you're using at any given point in time. And then management. That's really focusing on using those data insights to manage your licenses more effectively and not forgetting about your cloud spend as well. When we talk about building a SAM program, there's really 5 main areas, and it starts out with planning. So it's really all about aligning your IT software to the corporate strategy. That's really knowing what your current IT topology looks like, where the organization or the corporation is going. If in the next 3 to 5 years you intend to virtualize heavily, or you're going to make a real strong move to cloud, knowing those things helps you to plan that corporate strategy and or align with that corporate strategy. And then when you move to negotiate your agreements and maximize your value, a lot of companies will outsource to a third-party company like ISG or others to come in and really help them to strongly negotiate the terms and the pricing around those license agreements and get the best value. When you do that, if you don't have the processes in place, the standardized processes to deploy and the infrastructure to manage those licenses once you've completed the negotiation phase, you're going to see a lot of value leakage. You're going to see things where you've either under-licensed or over-licensed and maybe putting yourself in a position where you're adding some risk during an audit process. So you can negotiate the best agreement in the world with the deepest savings, but if you don't have that infrastructure in place to manage it ongoing, you may see all that value kind of erode away. And then last is retiring your assets, making sure you have standardized processes, clear, concise processes for how to retire and dispose of those assets in the long run. When you do these 5 different stages, it really has an output of about 3 things that we look at. One of those, some of the benefits you'll see is the control. Having controls in place allows you to really know what you're utilizing in your environment, when you really need to go purchase and when you don't. And knowing the utilization of those individual licenses allows you to reconcile against your entitlements that you've already contracted for. By having good controls around that, how you calculate your licensing prepares you for audits. So when they come in for an audit, being able, to utilize a tool or something of that nature, or just your processes, to create that output to hand to an auditor to say, this is exactly how many licenses we have, this is how we calculate the usage of our licenses, and handing to the auditor gives you control, kind of takes that control back to where you're not on your heels and you really just kind of put that on the auditor, and now you're in control of that audit process, which is exactly where you want to be. And then lastly here, when we talk about people, process, and tools, we really want to focus on the people and processes. We'll mention tools throughout here, and tools are a great aid, but having the greatest tool in the world can still get you in trouble if you don't have the right processes and people in the right places. So when we talk about insight, that's really understanding your corporate IT topology, where you're headed, what changes you're going to be making in the next few years, and kind of the layout of your organization. That will allow you to really focus on software consumption and your feasibility. So knowing your software consumptions, how utilized those licenses are, will allow you to really butt those up against your entitlements and start to measure where you really land as far as what you've contracted against and what you're really using inside of your organization. And then knowing those 2 things allows you to optimize and rationalize those licenses that you've paid for. And then put the controls in place. So when you have all those controls in place and you have the processes in place and you've heavily standardized, what that allows you is some upstream and downstream indicators to understand when things are going off the rails and you need to make some adjustments in your SAM environment.
Thank you, Brent. So I'd like to cover a little bit about what we find in software vendor audits and show you a few examples of audit interventions leveraging subject matter expertise for particular providers. As you can see, we've got 3 examples here: IBM, Micro Focus, and BMC. These were different clients, and these clients were engaged by these vendors, third parties, to perform an audit. In each one of these cases, they collected data. They took that data and provided it directly to after doing an initial analysis, provided it to the vendor, IBM, Micro Focus, or BMC, and that led to a very high dollar demand. In each one of these cases, as you can see, they were either a 7- or 8-figure demand. And in the last case, you can see that demand included licensing all the way back to 2008, more than 10 years. After we were engaged, we actually looked at what was going on in these environments, and we noted a few different issues from the audit that was being performed. In the case of IBM, as noted, no bundling was used. So therefore, each one of the licensed products that were counted in the environment were not mapped to the bundles that were actually purchased by the client from IBM. And the end result being the client was actually over-licensed. During this process, IBM had actually escalated to the CFO with a demand letter, a 7-figure amount. And at some point, IBM looked at the data that was being provided that showed bundling was not provided, and within a few days post that note, IBM followed up with an email indicating nothing was owed. So that was a very stressful situation for this client. It went on for many months, but as you can see, leveraging subject matter expertise can actually help you resolve some of the issues that may be highlighted through an audit process. In the middle scenario with Micro Focus, ISG was actually engaged to help them with this one because they were struggling with why they would owe the amount that they did. And during the process, there were a couple things that were noted. Demand included licenses for product that would be free in the near future from Micro Focus. And also it was noted that Micro Focus didn't really have a good way of managing the licenses that were, in other words, tracking them. Senior executives were all up in arms in this particular scenario, and they actually ended up settling at a 6-figure amount, even though we were able to ascertain that no compliance issues existed in their environment. In the last scenario, a detailed analysis revealed that improper assessment was done and had included some of the internal application jobs. They were not actually client jobs. So the number that was counted skyrocketed the amount of licenses that were required, even though they were not client-initiated processes. And we determined that the client was fully licensed. It was a 6-month process, but no penalties, fees were owed. As you can see, in all 3 of these scenarios, the vendor tactics were very similar, but they all really had the same end goal, which was incremental revenue. So as you can see, even though in these cases the clients did have some licensing expertise that they were leveraging, it did take leveraging subject matter expertise in order to help them sift through what the issues were in order to resolve some of the issues that they had from a compliance perspective that was being noted. In this next set of scenarios, these were not audit scenarios, but I wanted to share with you some Tier 1 software publishers and real-world examples of how risks were identified through a light touch analysis, what we call an initial license position, and then as some follow-up work was performed to clean up the environment, how it can actually bring these particular scenarios in line with the entitlements that these clients owned. In each one of these cases, as you can see, I used primary vendors, Oracle, Microsoft, and IBM as examples. An initial license position was performed, which included looking at entitlement and then also looking at the deployed software environment for the enterprise. In each one of these scenarios, you can see an under-license risk was noted to begin with as these environments were looked at. After going through and doing some cleanup in the environment, reconciling some of the issues, and also changing some of the deployment profiles that did not affect the applications running and supporting these clients. You can see that the issue was either completely eradicated, or in this middle scenario, as you can see with IBM, it was quite the opposite. It was determined that the client was actually over-licensed by the same amount. Therefore, that allowed them to reduce on their next contract renewal the amount that they would need to spend on an annual basis with IBM for software. So following an in-depth analysis, an audit compliant type of analysis, it can have a significant impact on making changes in the environment to either reduce your cost or eradicate risk that may be in the environment if you were to go through an actual audit process with the vendor. So we'd like to wrap this up with some areas to consider. As we've discussed throughout this session, managing software assets effectively puts you in control. Audits will become less frequent because vendors will actually know that you are tracking your software properly, you're compliant, and of course it's a waste of time and you will be able to defend your position. Keep in mind, software vendors have revenue targets, and any changes actually trigger audits. So those changes can be, as noted earlier, outsourcing, divestiture, and other scenarios. There's an audit process that vendors do follow, which is skewed in their favor. So it's really important that you put things in place where you can take control of the process. Thorough understanding of license requirements is vital to ensuring audits don't create non-budgeted expense. Seek external expertise. As I shared with you, can't be a subject matter expert for every product that you own or have that expertise for every product that you use in your environment. Leveraging external expertise can help you reduce your cost, optimize your environment, and keep you in a position where you're reducing your cost. So I think we'll turn it now to questions. Jillian?
All right, thank you, Dave. We do have a few questions. And the first one is, in example 1, was the data supplied to a third party legally okay, or would that have been an option for a counterclaim against IBM?
Yes, it is acceptable. Normally when you sign an agreement with a provider, that also includes language that a third party would be engaged to do audits. So that is usually part of your master agreement with these providers, and therefore there is no issue, and you've already agreed to that in the beginning, that a third party can be used. And more often than not, even as these things are kicked off, non-disclosures are signed to make sure everybody is minding their P's and Q's, so that's just normal part of the process.
Okay, perfect, thank you. Next question. Cybersecurity is increasingly a board decision, and governing bodies are paying more attention. Do you think SAM will become more important too?
Absolutely. SAM has become more important just with the cloud expanding, because software is much more easily to be deployed, moved around. So it's becoming more and more of an area of focus just because of the fact that it's so easily consumable now. So to the point that's being made, it follows, and I think it'll be in parallel in the security space as well, because of the fact that just the ease of use, ease of deployment, and movement across environments with the inception of cloud that we had over the past 15 years, or adoption rather.
Got it. Okay, thank you. Next up, in a software audit, what are some of the pitfalls you observe, or maybe the client's biggest sticking points?
Some of the pitfalls, I think one of the primary areas that we see an issue is deployment data, making sure they get a really good view of what's deployed in their environment. Usually that's some of the biggest gaps that we see. Brant, do you have anything else you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, there's the normal things that you're talking about, but in some cases there's even in the way that you contracted. So depending on who you contracted with, we've seen things where there's been a little bit of divestitures within yourself, and you have maybe a sister company who's accessing your systems. and what you didn't realize was you were contracted for a certain location, and now you're using licenses you aren't entitled to any longer. There's all kinds of different things, even from the beginning of the contracting stage, that can trip you up. And it's really just about having the right processes in place and the right upstream and downstream indicators so you can find these issues and make sure you're resolving them before it ever gets to an audit stage.
All right, moving on to our next question. You stated the vendors talk to each other. How can clients ensure you're not talking with these vendors?
Well, that's difficult to do just because the sheer fact, although with the recent changes in what's happening with a lot of respect to travel because of COVID, different vendors will be visiting their clients at different times, and people meet each other, whether it's at the hotel bar or whatever it may be, and they're talking about what's going on in their environments, and that word gets passed along. It's really hard to control that occurs, but we know that it does occur. So there's really not a whole lot you can do about it. I think the primary thing that you can do about it, and what we've been talking about today, is to really just put a good software asset management program in place. Organizations have done IT hardware management for many, many years. Just software has kind of been this runaway thing, and as I noted earlier, cloud has done nothing but exacerbate that issue because it's so easy to move things around, right, versus physical assets.
Okay, thank you. And this next question is a little longer, so I can repeat it if need be. But the question is, within a client organization where there is a person or persons holding on to the ownership of handling specific software license management, what is your best argument to help them let go of that control in favor of SAM? Because they, of course, will argue that they already get the best value.
So I think.
Go ahead. Sorry, Brad. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Dave. Go ahead, Dave.
Oh, sorry about that. We're wrestling over answering this question, as everyone can tell. That happens in a number of areas of organizations, and this is an example. The best argument that I think you can provide to them is it will give, if you put a software asset management program and structure in place, and a part of your organization doesn't want to participate in it, I would recommend making them a part of it, because tools and structure can actually help them track them easier. One of the things I like to approach when you have that, there are people that want to control their world, and I understand that happens in many different scenarios, but if you can present it in a way that it would make it easier for them and potentially help them even reduce their cost and take things off of their plate, that could be advantageous. Brant, do you have anything else you would add to that?
Yeah, I think you really covered it, but I was just going to say, along those lines, you don't necessarily have to pull back the control from individuals, but maybe folding them into a standardized SAM process and letting them be a part of that standard process really kind of fills the gap without completely pulling control back from individual groups.
All right, great answers. We have a couple questions remaining. This one is, what kind of complexity does SaaS introduce when trying to put effective SAM into place?
Really, SaaS is no different than all the other products that you use. The primary difference is that you're not getting in the old days, right, you'd get a CD or something like that, right, or download an install file. With SaaS, you're getting all the back-end infrastructure, but you still are able to track the resources. SaaS environments usually include logins, as an example, and you can track those users. You want to track the people that have come into your organization that need that SaaS account versus the ones that are leaving. So it's really just a matter of, software asset management is the same. It applies the same in a SaaS environment versus resources that you would gain directly from a provider and install via CD or a web link.
All right, and our final question. You spoke about people, processes, and tools and talked about being able to utilize upstream and downstream indicators in the control stage. Can you please give an example of what you're referring to?
Yeah, I think when you have the right standardized processes in place, the right standards, you're able to see things like an example of a downstream indicator is you're monitoring license usage against entitlements. All of a sudden you realize that you are over licensing against what you've actually contracted for. Well, that's a downstream indicator of a process that's failed upstream. But because you have the downstream indicator, you're able to go back, look at utilization of licenses, optimize, and you get that back under control. One of the things that would be an upstream indicator is things like when the company decides to shift. Maybe you're going more virtualized, maybe you're pushing to the cloud, as we've been talking about. As you're making those corporate changes and directional changes, that's an upstream indicator of problems that are to come. And if you have the right standardized processes in place, that's something you can easily adapt to. So really having the processes, the standardization, and those controls in place to be able to adjust to those upstream and downstream indicators is what we're referring to.
All right, great. Thank you both, and thanks everyone for joining. This does conclude our time today. As mentioned, the recording of this webinar will be available at the same link you used to register. If you have any questions or would just like to get in touch, you can find us at www.isg-one.com. Thanks for joining.